Hi everyone, this is Studio Slave, and in this video I'm going to be covering a comparison of Ableton Live 10 and Logic Pro X. I've been using both of these and teaching them for a number of years, so I know them pretty much inside out. I'm in a good position to give new producers or producers thinking of transitioning from one to the other, or maybe just learning both of these DAWs, a bit of insight into the pros and cons of both of them. So let's start off by looking at the price and value for money. So Logic Pro is very simple for this. It's £150 or 170 euros from the Mac App Store, and that is going to get you the entire Logic Pro package. Right out the box, all you have to do is install it, and then you can download all of the extra libraries, which is something ridiculous like 80 or 90 gigabytes of extra instruments and sounds which you can use straight away. And it really has everything you'd need when you're just starting out as a producer or singer or songwriter. Next up, we've got Ableton Live, which is a little bit more complicated. It's split down into 3 different versions, and it's also got a light version as well. So we have Intro, which is around 80 euros. We have Standard, which is 350 euros. And then we have Live Suite, which is 600 euros. So obviously, if you're a hobbyist, you're probably not going to jump in at Live Suite. But what you can do is you can demo Live Suite with absolutely no limits for 30 days to see if you like it. And then if you do, then you can maybe buy a lighter version and then upgrade as time goes on. Likewise with Logic, you can't demo Logic, but it does have a light version which is known as GarageBand, which is very, very similar, and it's looked at as the baby brother of Logic. So what you can do is you can demo that for free, and if you like it, then you can purchase Logic. I did mention with Ableton Live that you can also get a light version, and what this is it's something that ships with loads of different hardware brands, loads of different keyboards, things from Akai and Novation. And what it is it's just a light version for you to use with that hardware, basically to test it out and to allow you to use the hardware with a DAW, Digital Audio Workstation. So I'd recommend, if you are going to get Live, then to get the best value for money, either get something like Push 2, which is natively built by Live for Live, and that way you're going to get a bit of a discount if you get Intro, Standard or Suite with it. Or what you can do is you can buy a third-party hardware from something like Akai or Novation. I'd recommend something like the Akai APC40 Mark II because it's built specifically to work with Live for live performance. Just to go into a bit more detail on the different versions of Live, the Live Intro version only really has a couple of instruments. So you've got Simpler and you've got Drum Rack and a few others. Standard has a few more, and you also get a lot of the audio and MIDI effects. And then finally, Live Suite has absolutely everything and also comes with Max for Live as well. So really, I do recommend, if you are going to get Live Suite is really good. However, if you are using a lot of external plugins and you don't really need all of the extras like Max for Live, then go with Live Standard, and then you've still got access to all those plugins and all of the sampling capabilities that you need. So to round up the price and value for money, I'd say that Ableton makes things quite complicated with its tier system, and definitely you get your value for money with Logic Pro at 150 quid. So if you are going to get something just based on price and value for money, then I recommend getting Logic Pro. However, a point to note here is that Logic Pro is only available for Mac users, so if you're using Windows, then you are going to have to use Ableton Live, or you're going to have to download some sort of software to allow you to operate Mac applications on a PC. Okay, so now we're going to have a look at CPU and storage space. So I tend to find that although Ableton Live rides a little bit higher on the CPU, both of them tend to work at about the same efficiency. And we've got to be careful when we're comparing these, because if we go into the preferences, the CPU depends on quite a lot of different variables, but namely things such as the type of processing, so 32 or 64-bit processing, and whether we're using multiple core processing, and also the buffer size we're using. So like I said, CPU is roughly about the same, and now we'll look at storage space and the expandability. So with Ableton Live, the actual Ableton program itself is nice and compact. It's not too big at all, but what you can do in the different versions is it allows you to essentially add extra packs and add-ons, and to do that all we have to do is go down to Places here, we click on Packs, and in other versions such as Intro and Standard, this is where you'd buy things like Max for Live, and you'd also buy other instruments. So if you wanted things such as wavetable, analog, or operator, you could buy those. But in this case, I've got Suite, so as you can see, I've already got a whole load of libraries, and all you have to do to get these extra libraries is simply download from within Ableton Live. So it's a nice and slick process. By no means do you need any of these extra packs, however they are there if you want them. Now if we look at Logic Pro X, it works in much the same way. So we just go to the Logic Pro X drop down, we go down to Sound Library, and then from here what we can do is we can go and open the Sound Library Manager. And this is quite a new computer, so I've got quite a few things that I still need to add into Logic Pro, as you can see. But if I select all of these, then you can see it takes up 85 gigabytes, so it's nice that it tells you how much space it's going to use. Once again, you don't have to have these, but if you are going to be using Logic through and through and lots of the stock instruments and sounds and sample libraries, then go ahead and install all of this. But if you're tight on space and you're more of a third-party plugin person, then maybe don't install all of these if you're not going to use them. And then likewise, you can also uninstall these quite easily as well. Now looking at the reliability and stability of the two programs, I'd say that Ableton Live wins on reliability, especially for the older versions such as Ableton Live 8 and 9. I did notice that in Live 10 it is crashing every now and then. It's not too bad, however this seems to have been sorted out. I think it was one of the earlier Live 10 updates which has now been sorted. But as far as stability goes, then Ableton is a lot more reliable than Logic Pro. It does seem to be a bit buggy, and they seem to release new versions maybe a bit prematurely without beta testing as well as they possibly could. But both programs do have autosave features built in, so what this is going to do is if they do crash down for whatever reason, then when you next open up the project, you're going to be able to get a dialog box that says, would you like to revert to the last autosave, or would you like to revert to your own personal save? So as well as that, what we also have as well, if we go to File, you can see we've got Revert To as well, and we've got a list of the backups, and we can also save alternative versions as well. So this is if you want to test out, different ideas, different melodies, or whatever it is you're doing, then you can test those out, and it's essentially saving that as a copy. And then likewise, if we go into Ableton, it has a very similar feature. So if I click on Current Project, we've also got the backup folder, and what this is going to do is this is just going to auto-save what we're doing in the background in case of a crash, and then we can nice and easily revert back to this as well, just like we would any other project. And then what we also have, exactly the same as we did in Logic, is we have the ability to save an alternative or to save a copy as well. So now we'll have a look at the general layout and the user interface. So as you can see, Logic Pro looks nice and pretty. They've got lots of rich features with how the actual user interface looks, and it's quite pleasant to look at. We can see we've got our mixer window here, and we've got all of our plugins which we can see on the surface. We've also got our arrangement window, and then we've got other things such as our library and our inspector as well, and there's plenty more other panels hidden away which we can bring up using shortcuts or using the menu buttons here, such as our smart controls. So most DAWs do work in this sort of manner, where we have the arrangement window, which is it's based along the time domain. So obviously we have the start of the track here going all the way through to the end of the track here, which might be however long, 3 or 5 minutes later. If we jump into Ableton Live, Ableton Live is the only real exception for this. As you can see, we do have a very similar sort of view here. This is the arrangement view, which is plotted along the time domain. So we've got our bars and our beats, or we could also look at this as time down the bottom. And then we've got a few different windows which are going to populate either the devices or the clips. If we click on a clip, we can see the MIDI or audio. And then what we can do is we can tab across into session view. And this is a bit different. You can see here we get the mixer just like we would in Logic, and once again we can also pop open the devices windows and the clip windows. But the main difference here is that between our session view, which we're in now, and arrangement view, which we're in here, we can look at these as two completely different sort of panels or screens or ways of operating within Ableton Live. So this arrangement view, which most people are used to, is how we would create a finished track and then we would export it for people to listen to. But where Live comes into its own with its layout is that we can also go into session view, which what some people would maybe look at as being the sort of color palette or the drawing board of Live, where we can plot out our different ideas. So what I've actually done is I've copied a few of these sections back across into session view, but what you could also do is you could create these parts in session view as well, just by creating some clips. And what we can do here is we can play session view, and we can think, right, we don't want these parts to be playing, so we'll just turn them off. And we'll maybe try a different bass idea or a different kick idea, so we'll turn off different parts. And then we can copy these parts down to a new scene. And then what we can do is we can create these new ideas, and then we can record these ideas across back into arrangement view. And when people say they're using Live for live performance, then this is usually what they mean, using the session view, as what happens is as they play the loops, they're just going to carry on playing indefinitely until they decide to then stop them. So other things with the Ableton Live interface is if we go to Live and Preferences, you can see it all follows the same sort of theme. It all looks and feels the same. We can change this slightly here. We can make it look a little bit darker, but for now I'll leave it on the default. However, as you can see, rather than the devices popping open in a plugin type window like you'd expect, you can do it to some extent, but like a standard sort of third-party plugin, it doesn't really do that with Live. They just are held in these plugin chains or device chains, but because they all look quite the same, you sort of know what to expect. They're quite intuitive to be able to control and move around. Even if you've never used the device before, you can get a grip of how it works quite quickly. Whereas if we go into Logic Pro, then the plugins do pop out, and they are quite simple to use. I do like the newer plugins. They're quite nice to look at, and once again, they are quite intuitive. However, some of the older ones I am not quite a fan of. So if we look at something like Ultrabeat, and it just looks like a bit of a mess. It's not very intuitive at all. There's a lot of sort of hidden features and very specific areas of the screen that you've got to click to be able to use these plugins. But if you do look at some of the newer ones, so if you go to something like Alchemy, you can see that Logic has got back on course with how the plugins look. So you can look at this and you know where to find your sources, your filter, your master and your modulation sections. So they obviously can't get rid of the older things, the legacy plugins. They've kept them in there, but they are making a push towards making the interface more user friendly. A big plus for Logic is that, as you can see here, we've got our buses, we've got our audio effects and our instruments, and we can even see our EQ just at a glance from the mixer, which we can pop out into a separate window. If we go back to Live, say if we have this hidden for whatever reason, or we're working in a different view, we've still got the mixer here. This is actually a condensed version of the mixer, so we can still change the volume and the panning and things like that. But it would be nice if we could actually see what were in these clip slots from a glance. So a lot of people prefer to mix in Logic Pro because they can turn their devices on and off nice and easily. There is actually a way of doing this in Ableton Live using a text options hack, but it's not a default setting. It's not something that most users are expected to be able to do. You're actually expected to just go in to the device view here and change the settings in the device view. So that would be a nice feature to hopefully add in the future, is to have a bit more of a overall sight of what's going on within the project in terms of mixing. So looking a bit more into devices then, as I mentioned, Ableton Live, when you get the intro and the standard version, you don't really get a lot of devices. However, the devices you do get are really good. So this is the simpler device, which you can create entire tracks with, especially if you're making very sample-based genres. Then you don't really need much more than drum racks, simplers, or maybe the sampler device. It is nice to have these as well, but they're not essential. Whereas if we go to Logic Pro, Logic's version of the what would be considered to be the simpler is the EXS24 device, which once again looks quite complicated. It's quite a dated device, and we do find a lot of people that use Logic Pro and they need samplers. They're either working with straight up audio and just placing the audio where they need it within the arrangement, or they're using something such as Native Instruments Kontakt as their main sampler, which is a third-party plugin. just because they don't like using the EXS24. So that is something to bear in mind. But as well as that, looking at other parts, such as things such as the compression and other audio effects, I do like the user interface and how these look, and you can sort of tell as you click through these different compressors, apart from the name up here, just from looking at the interface and how it changes, you can see what sort of compressor models these are supposed to be emulating, and I do like the sort of differences between these. It's just a bit more interesting to look at. And likewise, if we look at things such as reverb, or how these are all nicely organized, it's very quick to choose the different sounds, or the different devices, sorry. You can see here, if we choose a different type, then it's just a bit more interesting to look at, and you can play around with the sounds. You get a bit more of a visual representation in Logic Pro. Not necessarily a good thing, because I do think you should use your ears at all times, and that should always be the first thing. However, it is just getting a bit more user-friendly. So now looking at DAW functionality, both of the DAWs allow us to have dual screens. So here we can open up a second window for Ableton Live and have something like the mixer on a completely separate screen. However, we can only have one separate window at the moment, whereas if we go to Logic Pro and we go to Window, you can see we've got all of the different panels we can open here, and we can open all of these in separate screens using shortcuts as well. So if I go to Open Mixer, we can see we have the mixer here, which we can move across into one screen, and then also using the shortcuts, what I can do is I can open some more screens as well, and then we can move these elsewhere. So Logic is a little bit better for this because it does allow for more than just one screen, but Ableton does have the function as well. So now looking at MIDI capabilities, I'd say Ableton's pretty good for the power it has with MIDI. So what we can do is we can actually time stretch or warp the MIDI. We can take it in the other direction as well. It won't be so obvious to see unless I unfold and move some of these notes, but I'll just do that quickly. What we can also do is if I select these, we can invert the notes, we can reverse them, we can make them legato, which is to lengthen them, and we can also add groove to them as well, quantize. There's plenty of features here, so we can just jump in, choose a groove template or a clip for these, and this is going to extract the groove of one of these sounds. You can also see that we get quite a neat way of being able to listen to how the groove is going to sound as well, and then we can apply that to whichever clips we want. As well as that, with MIDI editing as well, we can also select multiple clips as well. So try and find an example where we've got quite a few sounds together. We'll go for the synth buses. No, we'll go for these two. Okay, here we go. So if I recolor this clip, and what we can do is we can edit both of these at the same time on top of each other, which is quite handy. And if we go across into Logic Pro, likewise we can also do the same with Logic Pro as well, and all we have to do is press Shift and we can see we've got the two different clips here. And if we just select one, then we see we just get the single clip. And then we also have the regions up here where we can do things such as quantization, and we can also do that from down here as well to affect our MIDI. And then likewise, we also have MIDI effects, much like Ableton. So they're on a pretty even par as far as MIDI manipulation goes. In terms of navigation, both projects are pretty simple to navigate their way around. There's plenty of draggable or clickable areas depending on when the mouse is hovering over. You've also got your right click context menus, as well as the menus across the top as well. So there's many different ways of accessing the same sort of menus, and then as well as that, you've also got keyboard shortcuts as well for all sorts of different tasks, such as zooming in, zooming out, accessing your automation, and opening up a whole host of different menus. And likewise, this is the same sort of thing for Logic Pro as well, so we can navigate using all of the different controls. We can pop open the windows as we've seen earlier. All of these keyboard shortcuts are customizable as well by going into the settings, and we can see we've got the key commands where we can edit these as well. If you are using multiple DAWs, or for whatever reason you are struggling to learn the keyboard shortcuts, then I'll link up in the description. You can get some keyboard overlays which make it nice and simple, because you just simply put them over the top of the keyboard, and what that will do is just remind you exactly what buttons to press, because it's all nicely color coded as a gel overlay. Next up, we've got recording, takes and comping. Now I think this is handled a little bit better in Logic Pro. In Ableton, we could create a track and then record into it into the arrangement view and then edit it like that. But I actually think it's better to do it in session view. So what I'd do is I'd create a new audio track using the shortcuts. You can then go to audio from, and we'll set this to the external sound card. You can see we can go for input monitoring here. So it's putting me off a little bit. I'm going to turn that off for now. But that is how you'd be able to monitor your own voice. And then what we can do from here is just record different parts in. So we've got this part, which would be take 1. We can then move into take 2, take 3, and then take 4. So what we can do is now listen back to these, record different parts in. So we've got this part. We can then move into take 2, take 3, and that is how we would be able to record in Ableton Live. If we now go across, I'm just going to delete this track, into Logic Pro, it handles it a little bit better in my opinion. So what we do is we create a new track. We'll go for an audio track, and you can hear straight away it's turned on the input monitoring, so I'm going to turn that off just so it doesn't put me off. And we'll go for a real short section, and all I'm going to do is hit record, and it's going to automatically loop around this loop point that I've created, and each time it loops it's going to create a new take. So just to demonstrate this, we've got take 1 here, and then it goes to take 2, take 3, and then take 4. And then what we now do, if we just zoom in so you can see, using Ableton Live shortcuts in Logic. So now what we have is we have the audio in its track, and each one of these allows us now to just drag along, and it's going to allow us to choose different parts from each take. So if you had a session singer or musician, you could just get them to keep recording until they get it right, keep recording those extra parts, and you can either split these onto their own tracks if you're doing different things such as different harmonies or different passages, or if you just want to do the same passage until you get it right, then you'd do it in this manner where you'd be like, I like the part from take 4, I like the middle part from take 3, and I like the final part from take 2. Then this is how you'd be able to do that. And you can see this top audio track is now the final composition, so we've comped all of these parts together to create this final whole. Okay, so the next thing is things such as presets and channel strips. So in Logic Pro, we got this here. It's the channel strip setting. So for example, what I could do, in this case, this is an audio track, so I could actually load up a typical hi-hat setting. So here you can see it's got some compressors, it's added an EQ. We'll try it with a different sound. We'll go for a kick. There we go, kick. Modern kick, and you can see that's how it would EQ and compress a modern kick drum. And then from here what we can do is we can save this if we want. If we go and make our own custom one for an instrument or something else, we could save this and then recall it at a later date, or we could also just reset this back to its default. If we now go across to Ableton Live, Ableton does this in a similar way using something called groups and instrument racks. If we open up this, what you'd do is you would group all of these together. So here we've got some MIDI, we've got an instrument, we've got an audio effect, which is a Max for Life convolution reverb, and a bunch of other plugins. We just select all of these, press Command and G to group these together, and then we can just hit this button here, and this will then save as a instrument rack. So I can just hit that there, and that is now saved to my library. So I can go and delete this, and if I wanted to recall this entire channel strip, which now has absolutely nothing on it, it's just reverted back to MIDI, all I have to do is drag my instrument rack into the channel strip, and then it will populate along the device view there across the bottom exactly as it was before. And you can do this for multiple different parts. You can do it for instruments, MIDI effects, or audio effects, or all three. So in this case, this is a combination of all three in a instrument rack. So next up we have the smart mappings. So in Ableton Live, this is known as the macro controls, and in Logic Pro, this is known as smart controls, and it's essentially just how we go about mapping, either by MIDI or just mapping to the actual program for ease of use, so we can tweak the either third-party or stock plugins and presets. We can tweak those on the fly with a little bit more ease than actually having to dive into the plugin windows. So if we press B on this MIDI track here, we get the smart controls window in Logic Pro, and what we can do is we can go in and we can change these settings. So you can see here we can rename these, we can then map these here as well, and we can do things such as inverting the range and scaling as well. And then likewise we can also map these to external devices such as MIDI controllers. If we go across into Ableton Live, once we've grouped this, which we've already done, we then just press this, which is the macro button, and you see we get these 8 macro controls here, and then it's just a case of clicking the parts we want to map, and then we can map these to the macro controls. And if we click map on the actual macros, then once again we can do things such as inverting the range and scaling as well. And then it's just a case of pressing Command M or clicking up here so we can go into MIDI mapping mode. Okay, so let's have a look at how the two DAWs handle audio. So here we have Ableton Live. We'll just play this clip. This is in time. And without having to do any extra settings, what we can do is we can warp this as much as we want, and it's always going to stay in time. And we're just changing the project tempo. And this will actually work on the entire project with no extra work or no extra settings to be changed. So let's have a listen. And what we can also do is we can actually just warp this individual sample, and warp mode is automatically turned on in most cases, and then all we have to do is just drag this and we can move it elsewhere. We've got different warp engines which is going to affect the sound slightly differently, which Logic has a very similar function as well. And what we can also do is we can drop warp markers wherever we want, or we could just select the sample. If it was a loop that had obvious transients, we could get it to warp itself roughly how it thinks it should be warped. But with Ableton Live, we're a bit primitive with the transposition functions or any sort of pitch correction. We don't really have anything for pitching vocals well and doing a good job of it, so you'd probably have to use an external program such as Melodyne. So here you can see we've got transpose, which works slightly differently in the different modes here. Complex Pro gives you formants and an envelope, and you also get a fine detune in sense as well. But if we go into Logic Pro, the problem we have with Logic Pro is that you've got to actually manually activate the flex time. So this project at the moment, it sounds fine as it is, but if I change this project tempo, then it's going to wreak absolute disaster. And you can see all these samples changing length. And then we go back to normal. And if we try and flex these, what we have to do is we have to click on this, which is the same as Ableton's warping. So here we've got flex time slicing. Once again, we've got a bunch of different algorithms for how we want to flex. And then here we can move parts around and flex the audio as we see fit, or add in extra warp markers. So it's fairly similar. And then what we also have, which Ableton doesn't have, we go to the Vox here. We'll just listen to this. I've already got this turned on. This is Flex Pitch. So to access this, we just click on Flex Pitch. And you can see here what we can actually do using these different nodes is we can fine tune things such as the vibrato, the pitch drift, and we can actually move the notes completely, so we'll get quite a weird tone here. It's not super obvious. And you can hear, you get a preview of what's going on as well. So this is great for working with vocalists, and is as close as you're going to get to something like Melodyne without having to pay a lot of extra money to get the program. So some nice little extras we have with Ableton Live is what we can do is we have a few options here to slice to new MIDI track, convert harmony, convert melody, or convert drums to new MIDI track. So this is a nice way of being able to chop up different samples or take ideas and be able to recreate them in MIDI form. So for example, here I've got a drum loop. What we could do is we could take this and convert drums to new MIDI track. And what it's going to do is it's going to try and find the different frequencies and the different drums and make it into a MIDI track, and then it's found an instrument. So it's chose the Kick 606, so let's listen to that and how it sounds. And we now have that from audio form to MIDI form, and as you can see, it's done a pretty good job. We then have this little piano riff which I just quickly made up. And what we can do is we can right click and we can convert harmony to new MIDI track. And then what it's going to do is it's going to try and figure out the chords that are in this harmony. And as you see, it's done an average job there. It's not brilliant. This is still stuff that could be made better. However, so we can hear there that the reverb has confused the algorithm for the note length. And we've also got things such as slice to new MIDI track. And there's a bunch of different ways we can do this. And what it's done is it's sliced all of these sounds. So you can hear that's the main one. And then after that we've got the echoes. And then the final one is melody. So we'll go back to this piano sound and we'll go convert melody, and it's going to take these timing values and make this a monophonic note sequence. So this is quite good if you're trying to capture timing values or find out the notes of a bass part. The final thing I want to show you is Max for Live. So this, it didn't used to come with Live, but in 10 it's now bundled with Live Suite. However, you can get it as an extra. I'm not going to go into too much depth because it's a massive subject out of the depth of this video. But basically, it's open source. You can use it to build your own plugins within Live. What you can also do is you can download other developers' plugins as well, which are usually free. So it's a good way of collecting plenty of plugins to do things that Live can't actually do. And with Max for Live, the possibilities really are endless. So there's things such as integrating with electronics like Arduino, integrating with any sort of mechanics, being able to read things off the web, being able to take image and webcam sources and do things with them, being able to create visuals, being able to interact with other software. So if you've got some sort of really, specific live show and you need a way of being able to talk to Live, then you'll be able to do that through Max for Live. For instance, I use it to be able to sync up Ableton Live with analog turntables, so I can play vinyl but still have Ableton Live sync up to it even when I'm changing the tempo faders on a deck. So it really is a powerful extra within Ableton Live, and it's a deep subject, so I wouldn't recommend it for beginners. However, it's there when you're ready to progress and maybe do a bit more with Live and think a bit outside the box. So with Logic, we've got extras such as the score editor, which is a nice way of editing if you have a musical background. It's also quite nicely geared towards composition for TV and film, just because of how easy it is to sync up the audio to the visuals, and also because you have a very comprehensive sound library straight from the get-go just by downloading Logic, and you don't have to download any extras. So it's definitely enough to be doing things such as TV and film composition. As well as that, what you also have from a more singer-songwriter perspective is if we create a new drummer track, this is a great way of getting your ideas down. Maybe you don't have the technical skill, or you don't have the band members to be doing things such as certain instruments or backing tracks. As long as you've got a bit of knowledge in Logic Pro, what you can do is you can create a drummer track, and then using this XY controller, we can find something to suit the music we're making, and we can also use a feature called follow as well to get it to follow certain parts of what we've created to make it sound more natural. So just to demonstrate, so here we've got soft and simple. We can go to loud and complex, or anywhere in between. We can add different parts of percussion. We can add some swing. And if we go back, we can actually go to different genres. So we'll go for some tech house. And then you can see how quickly it would be to build a project in this manner if you didn't have the skill to actually write in the MIDI. And what's great about this is if I create a new software instrument and I just drag this MIDI or this drummer track down onto it, because at the moment this isn't actually MIDI. If we drag it down, not like that. If we drag this down and drop that here, you can see this is what the MIDI looks like. So what we could then do is, if this was a sampler, is we could go and change all of these notes to play different samples. So we've still got the sort of vibe that we're looking for, but using our own samples instead. Let's now do a comparison of hardware and software integration. So starting with hardware, both Ableton and Logic work pretty much the same. We know Ableton's got push to, Logic doesn't have a native sort of MIDI controller or control surface, but both of them work absolutely fine with all types of control surfaces and MIDI controllers, and a lot of them are mapped automatically as well, and you can have multiple MIDI controllers to control each DAW. We then have iOS apps and controlling the DAWs from iPads and iPhones. With Logic, we do this using Logic Remote, which is built specifically for Logic. And in Ableton, we don't have a native app for this, but we can do it with something such as Touch OSC. Now moving on to software, Logic Pro works great with other Apple products such as Final Cut, works quite well with Pro Tools, so it's quite an obvious thing to use for things like film composition and post-production. And as well as that, you can also rewire it into Ableton, and likewise you can rewire Ableton into Logic as well, which is what I know a lot of people like to do. So one of them is the master, one's the slave, and essentially you can use Ableton within Logic. People like to do that for things like quick workflow and sampling and hot swapping. Ableton, on the other hand, is a lot more geared towards live performance, so it works great using its Ableton Link function with things like Max for Live, which is obviously now built into it. Resolume VJ software, which is all sorts of visuals, lights and anything like that. And then you've also got the likes of DJ software such as Traktor from Native Instruments and Machine. So this is very often incorporated all into one big melting pot, using Ableton Live at the forefront of that for big live shows where you're having all sorts of different lights and synchronized sound and visuals going on. And you might also be using either plugins within Ableton Live or within Max for Live to trigger things such as Pyro as well. So this is all a very, very powerful live performance application, whereas Logic's not really geared towards that. It's more geared towards singer-songwriting type stuff and film production and composition. Okay, so we're now in Ableton Live 10 in a Studio Slave Techno project template. And what we'll do is we'll go to Preferences. And what we have here is we have the Control Surfaces area where we can add things like Push To or the Complete Control Mark II. And here we have the MIDI area where we can add MIDI keyboards and any other sort of MIDI devices. So here I've got Touch OSC, which is running on the iPad. What I can do is I can just, here we've got the record arm, so we can hear that's working fine. We'd also have the transport controls working as well if we had this set up as a control surface, but at the moment I don't. So with TouchOS C, like I said, it's not specifically designed for Ableton, so we've got this bridged here, so it's a little bit of a pain in the arse to set up. What I've had to do is go into the MIDI mapping in here, and I've mapped a few things from the mixer. So if we have a look, you can see I've mapped the group channels and some of the mute solo switches as well. Whereas in Logic Pro, this would all be mapped automatically, and it's much tighter because it's specifically built for Logic Pro. So now let's test this out. All we're going to do is hit play. And now we have control using the TouchOS C. And you wouldn't have to have this plugged in, but in this case I am, because I'm screen recording. I'm now in Logic Pro X in an audio template, so I'm just going to give this a play. And we're going to go to our control surfaces, setup, and we can see here that it's recognised both the iPad and the Komplete Kontrol Mark II as a control surface. So just to prove that, if I just stop the audio for a second, you can hear that it's working fine as a control surface. We've then got the iPad, and as we can see, this is Logic Remote. And what we can do is we can move through the different channels here using this top brace. And then what we can also do, which I think is really nice, is we've got all these different modes, so we could jump across into smart controls. At the moment we've got it on the mixer, we could have the keyboard, drum pads, and what I also found quite nice is chord strips. So just to demonstrate that, and this essentially gives us the different chords in the scale, and then we can choose the different octaves just by moving at different parts on the scale. So let's play that with the audio. Okay guys, so that was a hard and fast look at Ableton Live 10 and Logic Pro X. So what I'll say is that they're both equally about as good as one another, but it's not really about that. It's more about which one is best going to suit your case and your style and workflow. So in general, I'd say if you're using a lot of samples and if you're doing stuff like house and techno, you're probably better off going for something like Ableton. If you're more of a singer-songwriter and you're doing compositions for TV and film, then I'd probably go for Logic Pro. But don't take my word for it, check them out for yourself using the demo versions available. So for Logic, that's GarageBand, and for Ableton, that would be a 30-day free trial of Ableton Live Suite. See what you think of them, and make sure you put in the effort to try them both for at least a couple of weeks, because it is going to pay off in the long run, as the DAW that you start with is most likely going to be the one that you stick with, unless you have a very specific reason to learn another one, which does take a considerable amount of extra time as well.